So I have a few initial questions for the panelists, and I will start with Geoffrey. Geoffrey, looking back at the UNFSS in 2021, what would you say were the main commitments made to ensure the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in food systems transformation processes? And what has the UNFSS ecosystem of supports done since then to ensure that these commitments are really being met?
Thank you for the question. And I also want to thank the Hub for the invite and for this webinar, focusing on how we ensure that we have meaningful participation across this work. At the 2021 Food Systems Summit, there were several important commitments that were made in respect to Indigenous peoples' inclusion. And these included, first of all, a recognition of Indigenous peoples as distinct rights holders under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the implementation of free, prior, informed consent. There was also a commitment to include Indigenous peoples in decision-making processes, an acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples' food systems as models of sustainability, resilience, and biodiversity stewardship. And then after much advocacy that we worked on, one of the main outcomes of the summit was the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Food Systems Coalition as part of the Hub. I'd say against all odds, we formed this coalition of Indigenous peoples' food systems. We are currently the only coalition that are led by Indigenous peoples, and that brings together Indigenous peoples from all 7 sociocultural regions, member states, and UN entities, and supporting the advancement of our rights and food systems transformation at large. Within these summits, we continue to struggle for recognition of Indigenous peoples as rights holders, because despite the fact that the world often recognizes and understands that we steward 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, and evidence that our food and knowledge systems have the potential to transform food systems at large, we continue to face exclusion and conflation with other vulnerable groups across the UN system. I'm hopeful that this year at the +4, we don't have to fight again for meaningful participation in the summit, and we're here today showing a willingness to work alongside you. But we need you to also work alongside with us and respect our rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I, as an Indigenous person, I have to answer to my community on a global basis, and that's part of being a part of the Permanent Forum. And so, in including ourselves in these sessions and in this work, when we get criticism quite often because there isn't adequate representation, is a difficult place to be. I want to thank the member countries that are part of our coalition and really put the word out about how respectful we are and thankful that they are participating meaningfully in this process. Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Finland, Guatemala, Ireland, Lesotho, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Panama, and Spain are all members of our coalition and participate on a regular basis. I also want to thank the Secretariat at the World Food Program, as well as the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for the work that has been done. As far as the work that the UNFSS ecosystem has taken to support, there are some steps that have been taken. For example, the Indigenous Peoples Food Systems Coalition has produced important research, like the Wapala paper, and convened some dialogue and consultations. But structural change within the ecosystem itself has not materialized yet. So despite most of these stated commitments that we had previously and at the original summit, most of these remain unfilled in actual practice. And just so everyone knows, this is not an issue exclusive to international food systems work. We see this across the UN system, and I could copy paste this presentation quite often across different systems. But Indigenous peoples continue to experience marginalization, and global and national policy processes. Indigenous representatives and Indigenous peoples' organizations are often relegated to side events or informal consultations during these meetings without meaningful decision-making power. We continue to see inadequate funding and direct investment in Indigenous peoples, little funds for Indigenous peoples' food systems initiatives, capacity building, and self-determined solutions. Especially in this space, Indigenous peoples do not possess the administrative infrastructure to participate meaningfully. I, as a member of the SENA, and my other Indigenous colleagues were often paired with other extremely well-funded industry and NGO infrastructure and advocacy infrastructures that we just don't have in this space as Indigenous peoples. We continue to see Indigenous knowledge systems are undervalued or appropriated without proper recognition of Indigenous intellectual sovereignty. We don't see true power sharing or an ability for Indigenous leadership to be part of this resourced work. So the result is a system where Indigenous peoples are still too often left out rather than empowered in the design and governance of food systems transformation process. So we don't have, we aren't seeing adequate implementation of the declaration or of free, prior, informed consent. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Geoffrey, for your intervention.